The date is December 21st, 2025. In the high-stakes theater of American power, a sudden tectonic shift has just occurred. It's a move that reverberates far beyond the state lines of New York, echoing through the halls of the United Nations and into the very heart of the West Wing. Elise Stefanik, the firebrand congresswoman, the once rising star of the MAGA movement, and the woman Donald Trump handpicked to represent American interests on the world stage, has just done the unthinkable. She has walked away, not from her post at the UN, but from a race many believed was her ultimate destiny, the governorship of New York. According to reports from the New York Times and CNN, Stefanik has officially ended her bid for governor. The headlines are clinical, but the implications, they are explosive. Why would a woman at the zenith of her political influence, with the full backing of the 47th president, suddenly retreat? Tonight, we aren't just looking at a campaign withdrawal. We are performing an autopsy on a political strategy. We are looking at the collision between domestic ambition and global necessity. This is the story of why Elise Stefanik stayed in the trenches of international diplomacy and what it tells us about the volatile state of the world in 2025. To understand this, we have to look at the landscape Stefanik was attempting to navigate. For months, the narrative was set. Stefanik was the hometown hero returnee, the North Country representative who would finally flip the Empire State blue. It was a narrative of conquest. But as The Sun and the BBC have highlighted in their breaking coverage, that narrative hit a wall of reality. The reality is this: the world is on fire. As the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Stefanik isn't just a figurehead. She is the shield. In a 2025 defined by escalating tensions in the Middle East, a stalemate in Ukraine that threatens to boil over, and a China that is increasingly testing the boundaries of international law, the UN is no longer a talking shop. It is a battlefield. The pundits will tell you she dropped out because the polling in New York was difficult. They'll point to the $30 million war chest of her opponents. But let's be intellectually honest. Stefanik has never been afraid of a lopsided fight. No, the truth is more cynical and far more urgent. Leaves the UN now. The Trump administration loses its most effective blunt force instrument in international diplomacy. Sources cited by CNN suggest that the pressure to stay in Manhattan, the UN headquarters, not the governor's mansion, was immense. The administration couldn't afford a vacancy at the UN during a period of unprecedented global volatility. Think about the optics. If the United States' primary voice at the UN departs to run a state-level campaign, it sends a signal to Moscow, Tehran, and Beijing that Washington is distracted. It suggests that domestic partisan optics matter more than global stability. In the cold, calculated world of geopolitics, perception is reality. Let's analyze the Stefanik doctrine for a moment. She rose to prominence not through policy papers, but through performance. Her interrogation of university presidents over anti-Semitism wasn't just a domestic viral moment. It was a signal to the world that the American right was reclaiming the moral high ground on the international stage. By staying at the UN, as confirmed by her latest statements reported in the New York Times, Stefanik is choosing service over ambition. Or, if you're a cynic, she's choosing a seat at the table where the fate of nations is decided, rather than a seat in Albany where she'd be fighting over congestion pricing and subway repairs. But there is a darker undercurrent here. The 2026 midterms are looming. The Republican Party is at a crossroads. By staying in her federal role, Stefanik remains the purest vessel of Trumpism on the global stage. She avoids the inevitable mudslinging of a New York gubernatorial race that could tarnish her brand for a potential 2028 or 2032 presidential run. Is this a retreat? Or is it a tactical repositioning? The BBC notes that Stefanik's decision comes at a time when the UN itself is under fire. There are whispers of the U.S. defunding certain programs, of a total overhaul of international aid. Stefanik is the architect of that pressure. To leave now would be to leave the job half-finished. Let's be clear. New York is a graveyard for Republican ambitions. From Giuliani to Pataki, the ghost of moderate republicanism haunts Albany. Stefanik is not a moderate. She is a disruptor. Perhaps she realized that you cannot disrupt a system as entrenched as New York's bureaucracy, while simultaneously trying to dismantle the globalist architecture of the United Nations. You have to pick a fight. She chose the bigger one. Why does a New York withdrawal matter in a global context? It matters because it confirms that the Trump administration is prioritizing the global reordering. They are keeping their best players on the field where the stakes are highest. It tells us that the friction between the U.S. and the UN is about to hit a breaking point. Stefanik isn't staying to negotiate. She's staying to enforce. As we watch this play out, remember that in politics, a no is rarely a finality. It is a not yet. Elise Stefanik has closed the door on Albany, but in doing so, she has locked herself into the high-pressure chamber of global diplomacy. The world is watching. The UN is trembling. And the North Country Congresswoman has just decided that the world is a much more interesting stage than the state of New York. The question remains, when the dust settles on the 2025 global crises, will this decision be seen as an act of loyalty to a movement or a calculated move to avoid a defeat that would have ended her career? In the corridors of power, the line between the two is razor thin. Consider the timeline. In January 2025, Stefanik was nominated. By March, that nomination was temporarily shelved to protect a razor-thin House majority. In November, she pivots to New York. By December, she's out. This isn't just a change of heart. It's a structural realization that the modern American political machine cannot sustain a multi-front war. The Britannica reports on her career trajectory paint a picture of a workhorse. But even workhorses collapse under the weight of two contradictory masters. You cannot be the America First champion at the UN, cutting funding, challenging sovereignty, and staring down the Security Council, while also trying to appeal to the moderate suburban voters of Westchester and Nassau County who decide New York elections. The internal polling mentioned by the Washington Examiner suggests that while she led her primary opponent, Bruce Blakeman, the incumbent Kathy Hochul was holding steady. For Stefanik, steady is a death sentence. She is a candidate of momentum, of explosive growth. If the momentum stalls in the Hudson Valley, her national star dims. By withdrawing now, she preserves the myth of her invincibility. She exits the stage before the reviews come in. But let's look at the urgency factor. The 2025 geopolitical climate isn't just tense, it's transformative. We are seeing the Mar-a-Lago Agreement philosophy, as discussed by the German Marshall Fund, taking hold. This is a foreign policy that views international institutions not as partners, but as obstacles to be cleared. Stefanik's role at the UN is to be the clearing agent. According to Risk Advisory, her approach is significantly more confrontational than her predecessors. She isn't there to build coalitions. She's there to leverage U.S. funding to force institutional reform. She's targeting the International Criminal Court. She's auditing UNRWA. She's challenging China's significant inroads into technical organizations like the ITU. If she had left for Albany, who would take her place? A career diplomat? A moderate? In the eyes of the current West Wing, that would be a surrender. Stefanik is staying because she is the only one trusted to hold the line, while the administration prepares for what many call the Great Decoupling from the post-W2 international order. We must also talk about the mom factor. Stefanik cited her young son's safety and growth in her withdrawal statement. While critics will dismiss this as a standard political exit ramp, we shouldn't ignore the personal toll of 2025's political climate. When you are the face of an America First policy that is actively dismantling global norms, you don't just make political enemies. You make yourself a target. However, the political calculus remains the dominant force. As the New York Times noted, the Republican primary in New York was shaping up to be a bloodbath. Bruce Blakeman was already airing ads in Florida, not New York, targeting Trump's own backyard to sow doubt about Stefanik. Trump himself expressed consternation about having to choose between two allies. In the end, Stefanik realized that a primary win in New York might be a Pyrrhic victory. If she spent $50 million and 18 months only to lose to Hochul by 5 points, her career would be over at 42. By staying at the UN, she remains Ambassador Stefanik, a title that carries weight in every capital from London to Tokyo. This is the ultimate lesson of December 2025. The global stage is the new domestic stage. For the modern American power broker, being a governor is a regional promotion. Being the UN ambassador during a global reorganization is a historical promotion. Let's look at the why that the mainstream media is afraid to touch. Britannica and Wikipedia detail Stefanik's metamorphosis from a Paul Ryan-style moderate to a ultra-MAGA warrior. This wasn't just a change in talking points. It was a wholesale rebranding for the 2025 landscape. By staying in Manhattan at the UN, she avoids the Albany Trap. The Albany Trap is simple. New York Republicans are forced to choose between their base and the general electorate. If Stefanik ran, she would have been forced to answer for every Trump administration policy on immigration and social issues in a way that would alienate the very suburban moms she needed to win. At the UN, she is insulated. She is fighting the world on behalf of America. It is a much cleaner narrative for a woman whose ambitions clearly extend to the 2028 ticket. According to The Guardian, Stefanik's exit also signals a cooling of her relationship with Speaker Mike Johnson. She has publicly called him a political novice and accused him of more lies. By leaving Congress and staying in the cabinet, she effectively divorces herself from the chaos of the House Republican majority. She is tethering her ship directly to the presidency, bypassing the legislative wreckage that has defined 2025. We move now from the why of her exit to the how of her staying. To understand why the 47th president would essentially order his most visible female ally to abandon a high-profile state race, we have to look at the scoreboard of the 2025 global reordering. As reported by The Sun and analyzed by Risk Advisory, the United States is currently engaged in what some call financial warfare within the United Nations. By staying in her post, Stefanik isn't just attending cocktail parties in Manhattan. She is acting as the primary auditor of a system the administration believes is fundamentally broken. Think about the sheer scale of the leverage she now holds. The United States provides roughly 22% of the UN's operating budget and nearly 27% of its peacekeeping budget. According to the latest data from Donor Tracker, that amounts to billions of dollars that the Trump administration is now using as a cudgel. Stefanik's job, as she has articulated in her recent addresses, is to ensure that not 1 cent of American taxpayer money goes to organizations that undermine American sovereignty. This isn't just a talking point. It is a directive. The BBC highlights a specific friction point, UNRWA. For decades, this agency has been the backbone of humanitarian aid in Gaza. But for Stefanik and the current West Wing, it is viewed as an extension of hostile interests. By remaining at the UN, Stefanik is overseeing the systematic dismantling of U.S. support for this agency. If she were in Albany, she'd be debating New York's mansion tax or state university tuition. At the UN, she is effectively deciding the survival of international NGOs. Let's be intellectually honest. This is about power in its purest, most raw form. In New York, Stefanik would have been a governor under siege by a hostile state legislature and a cynical press corps. At the UN, she is the queen of the Security Council. She holds the veto. She holds the checkbook. The New York Times report on her withdrawal hints at this preferential power dynamic. She realized that being the 57th governor of New York is a prestigious job, but being the woman who broke the globalist status quo is a historical legacy. Now, let's look at the China factor, which CNN notes was a major topic in the private conversations between Stefanik and the president before her announcement. 2025 has seen China make unprecedented moves to fill the vacuum left by the U.S. in international standard-setting bodies, groups that decide the future of AI, 6G, and satellite communications. The Chatham House analysis suggests that China's Global Development Initiative is gaining ground in the Global South. If Stefanik leaves, the U.S. seat is filled by a deputy or a career diplomat who might not have the bully pulpit presence that she commands. The administration views her as their only A-list fighter, capable of staring down the Chinese delegation. The urgency is real. As we speak, there are votes pending on the status of Taiwan's participation in international health forums and the renewal of sanctions on Iranian oil exports. According to The Sun, Stefanik's presence at the UN is non-negotiable for the administration's 2026 strategy. They are planning a hard reset of the Security Council. They want to change the rules of the game, and you don't send a substitute into a championship game. But there's a deeper, more cynical layer here regarding the New York Republican Party. Sources cited by the Washington Examiner suggest that the GOP old guard in New York, the wealthy donors in the Hamptons, and the moderates in the Finger Lakes, were terrified of a Stefanik candidacy. They feared her ultra-MAGA brand would not only lose the governorship, but would drag down ballot candidates in swing districts. By withdrawing, Stefanik isn't just helping the president. She's avoiding a civil war within her own state party. She is letting the moderates run their candidate, likely someone like Bruce Blakeman or even a wealthy businessman. And when they inevitably lose to Kathy Hochul, she can stand on the sidelines and say, "I told you so." It's the perfect Icarus play. She flew close to the sun, saw the heat of the New York primary was going to melt her wings, and decided to pivot back to the cold, dark vacuum of international diplomacy where she is untouchable. As the BBC noted, her pivot was masterfully timed to coincide with a fresh wave of international crises, giving her the perfect, patriotic excuse to stay. We also have to consider the Vance connection. J.D. Vance, the vice president, has been one of Stefanik's biggest boosters. In the 2025 political ecosystem, Vance represents the intellectual right, while Stefanik represents the institutional disruptor. Together, they are the heirs apparent to the MAGA movement. If Stefanik becomes governor of New York, she is stuck in Albany for 4 years. She is out of the national conversation. She is dealing with snowplows and state budgets. But by staying at the UN, she remains on the short list for 2028. She remains the face of American foreign policy. She stays in the room where the big deals are made. The New York Times mentioned that her withdrawal stunned her supporters in the North Country. These are the people who have sent her to Congress since 2014. They wanted their representative in the governor's mansion. But the reality of 2025 is that the local is no longer the priority. The national and the global are the only stages that matter to the modern political elite. Let's analyze the specific power vacuum she is leaving behind in the House. As reported by CNN, her departure from Congress to focus 100% on the UN creates a special election in NY21. This is a district that has moved significantly to the right, but it is not a gimme. By leaving now, she is forcing the GOP to defend a seat during a period of legislative chaos. Why would she do this? Because, as The Sun implies, she is done with the House. She sees the House of Representatives as a den of vipers, where she can no longer exert the influence she once did as the GOP conference chair. The UN is her new fiefdom. It is a place where she doesn't have to whip votes from recalcitrant moderates. She only has to answer to one man in the Oval Office. This is the imperial. It's the perfect Icarus play. She flew close to the sun, saw the heat of the New York primary was going to melt her wings, and decided to pivot back to the cold, dark vacuum of international diplomacy where she is untouchable. As the BBC noted, her pivot was masterfully timed to coincide with a fresh wave of international crises, giving her the perfect, patriotic excuse to stay. We also have to consider the Vance connection. J.D. Vance, the vice president, has been one of Stefanik's biggest boosters. In the 2025 political ecosystem, Vance represents the intellectual right, while Stefanik represents the institutional disruptor. Together, they are the heirs apparent to the MAGA movement. If Stefanik becomes governor of New York, she is stuck in Albany for 4 years. She is out of the national conversation. She is dealing with snowplows and state budgets. But by staying at the UN, she remains on the short list for 2028. She remains the face of American foreign policy. She stays in the room where the big deals are made. The New York Times mentioned that her withdrawal stunned her supporters in the North Country. These are the people who have sent her to Congress since 2014. They wanted their representative in the governor's mansion. But the reality of 2025 is that the local is no longer the priority. The national and the global are the only stages that matter to the modern political elite. Let's analyze the specific power vacuum she is leaving behind in the House. As reported by CNN, her departure from Congress to focus 100% on the UN creates a special election in NY21. This is a district that has moved significantly to the right, but it is not a gimme. By leaving now, she is forcing the GOP to defend a seat during a period of legislative chaos. Why would she do this? Because, as the Sun implies, she is done with the House. She sees the House of Representatives as a den of vipers, where she can no longer exert the influence she once did as the GOP conference chair. The UN is her new fiefdom. It is a place where she doesn't have to whip votes from recalcitrant moderates. She only has to answer to one man in the Oval Office. This is the imperial ambassadorship. Historically, UN ambassadors have been sidelined or used for symbolic purposes, not Stefanik. In 2025, she has been given the authority to negotiate directly with heads of state. She is, in many ways, a co-secretary of state. According to Risk Advisory, her schedule in the last 3 months has included more bilateral meetings with European and Middle Eastern leaders than the actual Secretary of State. This is the leverage she would have had to surrender if she moved to Albany. She would have traded global power for state authority, and in the cynical world of 21st century politics, that is a bad trade. As we end this section, look at the image of Stefanik standing in front of the UN logo. It is a symbol of the world she is supposedly trying to reform, or perhaps dismantle. By ending her bid for governor, she has effectively doubled down on the America First global project. The pundits will call it a retreat from a tough race. We call it a refocusing of American power. The governor's mansion in Albany is a house of cards. The UN building in New York is a fortress. And Elise Stefanik just decided which one she wants to command. To understand the sheer magnitude of the decision Elise Stefanik just made on December 19, 2025, we have to stop looking at the map of New York and start looking at the floor plan of the United Nations Security Council. The mainstream media is framing this as a retreat from a difficult gubernatorial race. But if you look at the 2026 U.S. budget proposals and the classified briefings emerging from the State Department, a much more cynical reality emerges. Stefanik isn't retreating. She is being deployed as a financial liquidator. In the final weeks of 2025, the Trump administration signaled a hard reset of American participation in the international order. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, The proposed 2026 budget intends to renege on the vast majority of U.S. assessed contributions. We are talking about an 83% reduction in the contributions to international organizations account. For the UN, this isn't just a budget cut. It's a death sentence. And Stefanik is the one who will be holding the pen. Why does this matter? Because the UN is currently facing what Secretary General Antonio Guterres calls a race to bankruptcy. Reports from Counterpunch and Relief Web indicate that by the start of 2026, the organization will be forced to return credits worth $300 million to member states, emptying 10% of its remaining budget. If the U.S. withholds its $1.5 billion in dues, which Stefanik pledged to do during her January 21st confirmation hearing, the entire system collapses into a state of survival mode. The pundits in Albany were asking Stefanik about New York's migrant crisis. But in Manhattan, Stefanik is the one creating the crisis for the UN. By staying in her post, she is overseeing the withdrawal from the World Health Organization and the total defunding of the UN Human Rights Council. The White House executive orders from February 2025 were clear. The U.S. will no longer participate in bodies that it deems anti-American or pro-Hamas. Stefanik's job is to enforce that America First litmus test on every single agency, from UNICEF to the World Food Program. Now, let's look at the shadow war with Russia and China. During her Senate testimony, Stefanik was unusually blunt. She didn't talk about cooperation. She talked about curbing expansionist agendas. According to Pass Blue, she is specifically targeting China's significant inroads into technical agencies like the ITU and ICAO, the bodies that set the standards for global internet and aviation. If Stefanik had left for a gubernatorial run, the U.S. would have been represented by a placeholder during the most critical period of the Great Decoupling. China is currently positioning itself as the alternative donor for the Global South. By staying, Stefanik is essentially telling the world, if you want American money, you must reject Chinese influence. It is a return to a Cold War style of transactional diplomacy that a moderate Governor Stefanik could never have engaged in. The Guardian reported on December 19th that EU leaders have agreed to a €90 billion loan for Ukraine, but notably without using frozen Russian assets. This reveals a massive fracture in the Western alliance. While Europe is trying to find legal workarounds, the Trump administration, via Stefanik at the UN, is pushing for a peace-through-strength deal that many fear involves significant territorial concessions. Think about the leverage. If Stefanik remains at the UN, she holds the veto power that can block any UN-led peacekeeping mission in Ukraine that doesn't align with the president's vision. She is the gatekeeper. In Albany, she would have been fighting over New York's school funding. At the UN, she is the primary architect of the new European security architecture. But let's get even more cynical. According to reports from Semaphore, the relationship between Stefanik and House Speaker Mike Johnson has completely disintegrated in late 2025. She has publicly called him rudderless and a liar. By ending her bid for governor and simultaneously announcing she will not seek re-election to the House, Stefanik has effectively burned every bridge back to the legislative branch. She has put all her chips on the executive. She has transitioned from a politician who needs voters to a diplomat who only needs the favor of one man. The Britannica and Wikipedia biographers will note this as the moment she ceased to be a representative of the 21st District and became a pure instrument of the Trump presidency. The urgency is highlighted by the Article 19 threat. If the U.S. continues to withhold dues at the levels Stefanik is proposing, the United States could technically lose its vote in the UN General Assembly within 3 years. Stefanik isn't worried about that. In fact, her rhetoric suggests she welcomes the confrontation. She is staying at the UN to prove that the UN needs America more than America needs the UN. It is a high-stakes game of chicken with the entire world. So, When you see the headlines about her dropping out of the New York race, don't see it as a loss. See it as a promotion to the front lines of the global disorder. She is leaving behind the accidental governor, Kathy Hochul, and the messy Republican primaries to focus on the great reset of the international system. So, here is the final summary. Elise Stefanik didn't quit on December 19, 2025. She ascended. She realized that in the current era, being the governor of New York is a defensive position, while being the UN ambassador is an offensive one. She has chosen to be the hammer of a superpower rather than the manager of a state. The world in 2026 will be a colder, more transactional place. The UN will be smaller, poorer, and more divided. And at the center of that storm will be Elise Stefanik, the woman who decided that the world was a much more interesting stage than the state of New York. The question isn't whether she could have won New York. The question is, now that she has the keys to the international system, what does she intend to burn down first?